The Crossing. May 13, 1943. Tunisia. The day everything changed. Private Klaus Becker stood among 250,000 surrendering Germans and Italians, the Afrika Korps defeated at last. The legendary force that had battled across the scorching deserts was no more. Within days, Klaus found himself crammed into a holding camp in Casablanca, wondering what came next. Russia? A brutal British prison? The rumors spread like wildfire through the desperate men. Then came the ships. Liberty vessels that had brought American supplies now returned carrying human cargo, enemy soldiers bound for the unknown. Klaus boarded with his unit in early June, his stomach churning with equal parts fear and relief. As the Atlantic opened before them, he noticed something shocking. The American guards offered cigarettes, writing paper and books. On deck, German prisoners played shuffleboard, while wounded American soldiers looked on wistfully at the empty swimming pool. The crossing was surreal, Klaus would later write. We dined on ice cream and stewed plums while the U-boats hunted beneath us. The ship zigzagged constantly to avoid torpedo attacks, but compared to the hell of Tunisia, this felt like salvation. For 2 weeks, Klaus watched the endless ocean, processing the impossible truth. He was heading to America, not as an invader, but as a prisoner, and somehow, inexplicably, he felt safer than he had in years. Dust and barbed wire. The train clattered southwest for 3 days. Klaus pressed his face to the window, watching America unfold, endless fields, small towns, faces staring back at curious and afraid. On June 4, 1943, they arrived in Texas. The entire town of Mexia had gathered along Railroad Street, mouths agape, as armed 1,850 battle-hardened Germans marched in perfect formation to Camp Mexia, 4 miles west. Klaus's first sight of the camp stopped him cold. 10-foot barbed wire fences stretched toward the horizon, guard towers looming like sentinels. The Texas heat hit him like a physical blow, even worse than Tunisia. "Welcome to your new home," the American sergeant barked. Inside, rows of wooden barracks stretched across the compound. Each building housed 60 men in cramped conditions, but it was clean, structured, and mercifully free of artillery fire. The first night, Klaus lay on his bunk, surrounded by the sounds of 1,850 men processing their new reality. Some wept quietly, others maintained stony silence. The hardcore Nazis in the corner sang defiant songs, but Klaus noticed something else. Through the mess hall window, he'd seen American soldiers eating the same rations, living in similar barracks. The Geneva Convention in action. The routine began immediately. Morning roll call at 0600. Inspections by German officers who were somehow harsher than their American captors. By week 3, Klaus understood the truth. The Americans ran the camps, but the Germans ran the prisoners, and that complicated hierarchy would shape everything to come. Enemy hands, friendly fields. I need workers. Crops are rotting in the fields. The American farmer's voice carried desperation. By late summer 1943, Texas faced a critical shortage of over 300,000 agricultural workers. Every able-bodied American man was overseas fighting. Someone had to bring in the harvest. Klaus volunteered for the work detail, anything to escape the fence. At dawn, armed guards loaded 60 prisoners onto trucks bound for nearby cotton fields. The work was backbreaking, 10 hours under the brutal Texas sun, dragging heavy cotton sacks down endless rows. But Klaus noticed something remarkable. The farmer's daughter brought them cold water. The farmer himself showed them proper technique, speaking slowly in broken German English. For this labor, Klaus earned 80 cents per day in canteen coupons. The farmer paid the government 1.50 cents. The difference funded the entire POW program. By October, Klaus's work detail had expanded to include peach orchards, rice fields, and pecan groves. The physical exhaustion was total, but for the first time since his capture, Klaus felt useful, human. Late one afternoon, as golden light swept across the cotton field, the farmer's wife drove up with sandwiches and lemonade. She set the food on the truck's tailgate and said, "My son's fighting in France. I pray someone's treating him this well." Klaus couldn't respond. His English was too poor, but he understood. In that moment, the enemy became something more complicated. The farmer waved goodbye as the trucks departed, and Klaus found himself waving back. The war suddenly felt very far away. The marshal's warning. Stay away from the local girls. Marshal Jack Morrison's warning echoed through the compound during the November inspection. 2 prisoners from a nearby camp had been caught writing love letters to American women. The punishment was swift, transfer to a maximum security facility, but warnings couldn't suppress human nature. Klaus first saw her at the county store in town during a supervised supply run. Sarah Henderson, 19 years old, working the counter while her father managed the shop. Their eyes met for barely 3 seconds before the guard hurried the prisoners along, but 3 seconds was enough. Over subsequent trips, Klaus managed furtive glances, then a smiled exchange, then whispered words while pretending to examine tools. "This is madness," his friend Werner hissed. "You'll destroy everything." But Klaus had spent 18 months in hell. Tunisia, the surrender, the crossing, the endless cotton fields. Sarah's smile represented something he thought war had killed, the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by violence. They began leaving notes hidden in specific locations, behind a loose board in the store, underneath a particular rock near the worksite. December brought complications. Sarah's boyfriend returned home on medical leave, wounded at Anzio, bitter and suspicious. Someone reported seeing Sarah near the fence line. Marshal Morrison increased patrols, questioning locals about unauthorized contact. Klaus knew the risks. Discovery meant transfer, possibly to a punishment camp, but every time he saw Sarah's handwriting on those hidden scraps of paper, he felt something stronger than fear, hope, even if hope was the most dangerous thing a prisoner could possess. Christmas behind the fence. Snow was rare in Texas, but Christmas Eve 1943 brought an unexpected dusting. Klaus watched through the barbed wire as Mexia's church bells rang across the frozen fields. Inside the compound, the Germans had transformed their recreation building into something magical, a theater for their Christmas celebration. The stage featured elaborate wooden decorations carved by prisoners, candles arranged in careful patterns, and a choir of 30 men who'd spent weeks rehearsing carols. Camp authorities had approved the event, inviting local townspeople to attend. Klaus couldn't believe it when the gates opened and actual American civilians filed in, farmers whose fields they'd worked, shopkeepers they'd seen in town, even Sarah and her family. The concert began with Still Knocked, Silent Night. Klaus sang from the second row, his voice joining hundreds of others. Halfway through, he noticed several American women crying. The farmers removed their hats. This transcendent moment existed outside of politics, nationality, or war. It was simply humans acknowledging their shared humanity during the season of peace. After the concert, the camp commander allowed brief, supervised interaction. Klaus found Sarah near the refreshment table. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, slipping a small wrapped package into his hand. Before he could respond, her father appeared, stern-faced. But instead of anger, the old man extended his hand. "My son wrote from Italy," he said. He mentioned a German prisoner who shared his rations after a bombing. "Maybe it was you. Maybe it wasn't. But tonight, I'm choosing to believe in something better than hate." As the townspeople departed and the gates closed, Klaus unwrapped Sarah's gift, a small book of English phrases and a photograph of a Texas sunset. On the back she'd written, "For when the war ends, and you need to find your way home." Klaus didn't sleep that night, staring at that photograph, reimagining what home might mean in a world beyond the wire. Letters from the Ruins. March 1945. The letter arrived with a Red Cross stamp, forwarded through Switzerland. Klaus's hands shook as he recognized his mother's handwriting. The first word from home in 8 months. "Dresden is gone," she wrote in cramped, desperate script. "The fires burned for days. Your father searches the ruins for survivors. We have nothing left but each other, and hope that you're alive somewhere." Klaus read those words sitting on his bunk, while his barracks mates played cards and laughed at someone's joke. The contrast felt obscene. Around him, men ate 3 meals daily, slept in heated buildings, and complained about the quality of the coffee. In Germany, his family picked through rubble for scraps of food. The guilt was crushing. By April, news reached the camp that Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The war was over. The prisoners reacted with mixed emotions: relief, despair, uncertainty. Klaus noticed something startling. Many of the younger prisoners seemed lost, as if the war's end had stripped away their entire identity. Then came something that changed everything. In late May, the Americans showed films from the liberation of the concentration camps. Klaus sat in the darkness of the recreation hall, watching footage from Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. The skeletal figures, the mass graves, the mountains of shoes and eyeglasses. Around him, prisoners wept, vomited, or sat in stunned silence. "This cannot be real," someone whispered. "This is propaganda." But Klaus knew, with sickening certainty, that it was true. One elderly prisoner stood up mid-film and tore his German uniform into pieces, sobbing, "What have we done? My God, what have we done?" That night, Klaus lay awake processing what he'd witnessed. He'd fought for Germany, believed in his country, followed orders. But this grotesque machinery of death operating while he'd marched across North Africa. The re-education program suddenly made sense. The books by Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque, the subtle lessons about democracy, the American guards who'd treated them as humans rather than monsters. The Americans weren't punishing them. They were trying to save them from what they'd become. Klaus picked up Sarah's English phrasebook and began to study with new purpose. Whatever world emerged from these ashes, he wanted no part of the old one. The Democratic Experiment. Summer 1945. Camp authorities announced a new program, intensive courses in democracy and American government. Klaus volunteered immediately, joining 120 other prisoners selected for the Special Projects Division's experimental curriculum. The American professors arrived with idealistic energy, university men who'd never worn uniforms carrying boxes of books and phonograph records. Their goal was audacious: transform enemy soldiers into convinced Democrats in 6 intensive weeks. The classes met in the converted mess hall. Klaus sat among men who'd commanded tanks, piloted fighters, and stormed beaches. Now they studied the Federalist Papers and debated the merits of representative government. Professor Henderson, Sarah's uncle, Klaus discovered with shock, led passionate discussions about freedom of speech, separation of powers, and the rule of law. In a democracy, Henderson explained, the government serves the people, not the other way around. The curriculum included everything Americans thought Germans needed: films showing prosperous cities and happy workers, readings about Lincoln and Jefferson, music from Irving Berlin and George Gershwin. They published a camp newspaper called Der Ruf, where prisoners debated political ideas freely, something that would have meant death in Nazi Germany. Klaus devoured it all, not because he believed everything without question, but because it offered an alternative to the ideology that had led to catastrophe. The hardcore Nazis in camp called the program participants traitors. "You're being brainwashed," they sneered. "When we get home, you'll answer for this collaboration." But Klaus noticed something. After the concentration camp films, opposition to the re-education programs collapsed. Even the most stubborn began asking questions. By late August, Klaus had completed the program. He received a certificate and a handshake from the camp commander. More importantly, he'd learned enough English to write a proper letter. That evening, he composed his first message to Sarah in months, describing not just his feelings, but his transformed understanding of the world. The democracy experiment hadn't turned him into an American, but it had helped him imagine becoming a better German. Ice cream and Coca-Cola. September 1945. The war was over, but Klaus remained a prisoner. President Truman delayed repatriation. American farmers desperately needed harvest help, and labor unions opposed releasing POWs, while American soldiers still sought jobs. So Klaus continued working the Texas fields, now with a strange new status: the enemy who'd become almost invisible. In town, he could spend his accumulated canteen scrip at local shops with minimal supervision. Klaus stood in the general store, contemplating an impossible choice: ice cream or Coca-Cola. Both were luxuries he hadn't been able to buy in Germany for years. Even before the war, he chose the Coca-Cola, savoring the sweet, fizzy taste while standing on a Texas street corner. An elderly woman passed by, nodded politely, and said afternoon. Klaus managed "Good afternoon, ma'am" in his careful English. This casual normalcy, this ordinary moment of human civility, felt more surreal than anything he'd experienced in combat. The small freedoms accumulated: Saturday trips to town, movie nights at the local theater where prisoners sat in a designated section, the annual camp festival where locals and prisoners competed in soccer matches and shared barbecue. Klaus learned to play baseball poorly and developed a taste for hamburgers. He discovered American jazz and found it oddly moving. These weren't grand political transformations. They were the slow domestication of former enemies into something resembling neighbors. But contradictions remained. Black American soldiers guarded white German prisoners who could enter restaurants those same guards couldn't. Klaus noticed this injustice and struggled to reconcile it with the democracy Professor Henderson preached. When he asked about it, Henderson sighed deeply. "We're not perfect," he admitted. "Democracy is a process, not a destination. We're still learning too." That honesty, that admission of American failure alongside American ideals, impressed Klaus more than any propaganda could have. In late December, Klaus received notice. Repatriation would begin in January. He had 3 months to prepare for a return to a Germany he could barely imagine. That night, he bought 2 Coca-Colas, one for himself, one for Werner, and they sat under the Texas stars, trying not to think about what came next. The long goodbye. January 1946. The trucks arrived at dawn, carrying prisoners to the rail yard. Klaus clutched a small bag containing his few possessions: letters from home, Sarah's photograph, his English phrasebook, and certificates from the re-education program. The goodbyes were harder than expected. Farmers who'd employed him for 2 years shook his hand solemnly. Marshal Morrison, who'd once threatened him over Sarah, nodded respectfully. Even some townspeople gathered to wave. Sarah was there, standing slightly apart from the crowd. They'd said their real goodbye 3 nights earlier, away from prying eyes, a conversation that had lasted until dawn, full of promises that both knew were probably impossible. Now, with witnesses everywhere, she simply pressed a small envelope into his hand. "Don't open it until you're on the ship," she whispered. Klaus nodded, not trusting his voice. The train journey east took 4 days. Prisoners crammed into cars that felt confining after the relative freedom of camp life. At Norfolk, Virginia, they boarded a Liberty ship bound for Hamburg. Klaus finally opened Sarah's envelope. Inside, a letter and a small gold cross on a chain. "So you remember," she wrote, "that in the darkest times, some people chose to see the human in the enemy. Come back when you can. We'll be waiting." The Atlantic crossing was nothing like the journey west. Then Klaus had been terrified, defeated, uncertain. Now he was simply exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually drained by 3 years that had transformed him utterly. The ship docked in Hamburg in mid-February. What Klaus saw shocked him. The city was rubble, block after block of destroyed buildings, streets cleared just enough for vehicles to pass. Hollow-eyed Germans shuffled through ruins, searching for food, firewood, anything useful. This was victory? This was liberation? The British processed them quickly. Brief interrogations, medical checks, confiscation of any remaining American currency. Then they were free. Klaus stood at the Hamburg station with his small bag, holding a ticket to Dresden purchased with money the Red Cross had provided. Around him, former prisoners dispersed like ghosts, heading toward uncertain futures in a broken land. Klaus noticed several men tucking their re-education certificates deep into their bags, proof of collaboration that could bring trouble from unreformed Nazis or suspicious Soviets. But Klaus kept his certificate visible. He'd earned it, and he wouldn't pretend otherwise. The train to Dresden departed at midnight. Klaus found a seat, exhausted, and watched the ruined German landscape slide past the window, wondering if anything he'd learned in Texas could possibly matter here, in this devastated homeland that felt more foreign than America ever had. Return to Nebraska, August 1951. 5 years after returning to Germany, Klaus stood at the port of New York, breathing American air for the first time as a free man. The journey back had taken years: paperwork, sponsorships, immigration quotas. Sarah's father had vouched for him. The farmer he'd worked for provided an affidavit. Professor Henderson wrote a glowing letter. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 finally made it possible. Klaus was one of approximately 5,000 former German POWs who emigrated to America after the war, choosing the country that had held them captive over the homeland they'd fought for. He traveled to Nebraska, not Texas. Sarah had moved there for work, teaching at a rural school. The reunion at the Omaha train station was awkward at first, 5 years of letters failing to prepare them for the reality of each other's changed faces. But when Sarah smiled, Klaus saw the same person who'd risked everything to pass notes to an enemy prisoner. "Welcome home," she said, and he nearly wept at hearing those words. They married 3 months later in a simple ceremony attended by former farmers who'd employed POWs, townspeople who'd slowly learned to see Germans as people rather than enemies, and 2 other former prisoners who'd also returned to settle in America. Klaus found work as a mechanic, his skills from the German army translating to civilian life. He joined the local Lutheran church, learned to follow baseball with genuine enthusiasm, and mastered English well enough that his accent became merely charming rather than incomprehensible. He never forgot Germany, sent packages to his family, followed news of Reconstruction, felt grief for what had been lost, but America became home in ways he couldn't have imagined on that terrified Atlantic crossing in 1943. The democracy experiment hadn't brainwashed him. It had simply shown him an alternative. In 1963, Klaus became an American citizen. The ceremony took place in the same courthouse where Marshal Morrison had once warned him away from local girls. Morrison was there, retired now, watching with satisfaction as former enemies raised their hands to swear allegiance to the United States. Afterward, Klaus stood on the courthouse steps with Sarah, watching their 2 children play on the lawn. He thought about the young soldier he'd been, fighting for a cause he barely understood, captured, transformed by ice cream and Coca-Cola and books and the simple act of being treated as human. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. Klaus smiled. "That barbed wire makes better fences than borders," he said, "and that sometimes being captured is the first step toward becoming free."